So how can we best talk to people in order to help them normalize what are sometimes pretty extreme experiences? What kind of language can we use to facilitate this? I'm going to cover that in this video, but I'm also going to talk about what kind of language and ways of talking we want to avoid so that we don't inadvertently do the opposite of normalizing. Because if we aren't careful, our way of talking and use of language can make people feel more abnormal and more alienated from everyone else. Now, Oryx Cohen is now a leader within the National Empowerment Center. But he said when he encountered the mental health system after his first psychotic episode, the way they talked to him about his experience and got him to think about his mental condition made him feel that he had just lost his membership in the human race. Now, unfortunately, his experience is not particularly uncommon, and it's something that we as mental health professionals really have to get better at avoiding. So I'm going to talk about how to avoid that kind of effect on people and also help people move in the opposite direction towards normalizing their experience. So one important point, I think, is how often people with psychosis themselves use language which exaggerates their difference from us. For example, you yourself, have you ever felt something like a separate spirit or demon inside you that wanted to do something different than what you wanted to do and tried to take over your body and make your body do what it wanted? Um, does that sound like something you've experienced? Now ask yourself, have you ever tried to go on a diet but then had to struggle with some impulse inside of you that wanted chocolate cake? That's really the same kind of thing. And noticing the similarity is part of normalizing. It's actually normal for us to have something inside us that wants to take us over and do something different than what our conscious mind would like to do. So while we could say that our clients' use of language that exaggerates the difference between themselves and others, we might think, well, we could talk, maybe that's part of their delusional process or mental illness. It's actually interesting that the mental health system also tends to exaggerate the difference between the diagnosed and the not diagnosed. And that's what I'm calling here abnormalizing. So one way we distance ourselves from diagnosed people is to see their behavior in terms of symptom categories, while our similar behavior goes by different names. Compare, for example, the way you might think and talk about a person diagnosed with schizophrenia who hears a voice that's criticizing him or her, and the way we might talk about the average person who's thinking things over and having some self-critical feelings and thoughts, while maybe wishing they were being nicer to themselves as they had those thoughts. Now, really, these two people may be having, in many ways, very similar experiences, but really we'd only talk about one of them as attending to internal stimuli, the person diagnosed with schizophrenia, even though really both of them are attending to internal stimuli. And we ordinarily might not notice many similarities between automatic self-critical thoughts, let's say, and voices. But noticing those similarities and talking about them and placing any differences on a continuum with what's normal is what normalizing is about. Now, one reason people, including mental health professionals, sometimes exaggerate the difference between themselves and those who've been diagnosed with things like schizophrenia is that it helps us disown or project our feeling of vulnerability to catastrophic mental mistakes and madness. We project that out, that vulnerability, onto the diagnosed person. But the problem with that is it kind of dehumanizes the diagnosed person and makes it harder for them to see themselves as somebody who can recover and become like others, while it elevates us, the people that are designated as normal, to actually being seen as more sane than we actually are. And then it also makes it harder for us to listen when people who have been diagnosed actually have helpful things to say, or when they're actually onto something. So it's said that it's a mark of maturity and mental health to be able to tolerate ambiguity and seeing the world with less of a dividing line between the sane and the insane requires just such a toleration of ambiguity. I believe that a lot of our mental health language has been designed to make things seem less ambiguous than they actually are. And that's why a lot of that language tends to cause problems. Another way of looking at this, uh, you know, so-called normal people have we have a lot of stuff going on inside us that's outside of our conscious identity. And they go by various names, impulses, automatic thoughts, mood and emotions, memories that just emerge sometimes out of nowhere, our imagination, our inner voices. Uh, and then, you know, when people are experiencing what we call psychosis, they often tend to feel that they shouldn't have stuff inside them that goes beyond their conscious mind. They think they should be more in control. Research has actually found they think they should be more in control of their mind than the average person does. And so they tend to then define or perceive the stuff they don't think should be in their mind as something that's definitely outside of them, not part of them. Another way of looking at that is they tend to be so upset with their thoughts and emotions that they go to the point of disowning them. That's so stupid or evil, it couldn't be me thinking it. And once the person decides that that can't be them having the thought, they might start sensing it as so separate that it seems to be coming from an external voice, or they can develop real delusional beliefs about its identity. It's a demon talking to me, or it's the CIA talking to me through a device they inserted in my brain, or it's telepathy coming from the neighbors. But the cognitive therapy perspective, the normalizing perspective, is that there's really nothing stranger than the thoughts that go through our minds. I've used self-disclosure about some of my own stranger thoughts and images, and then, just ask people, well, how would I know if someone else put that in my mind? Or do you think maybe my mind could just make that up? Normalizing our brains being weird is really helpful. For example, talking about what happens when we dream, or what can happen within various trance states or hypnosis, can help people own their own internal experience, or at least be open to the possibility, gee, maybe my mind can come up with stuff like that. Now, it's important to recognize, by the way, that a lot of healthy people also frame their internal experience in some of these ways. They may see themselves as receiving communication from God or the devil, or from some kind of spirit guide, or they hear a voice that sounds external to them. As long as they manage it well, that can be really not a problem. But when people have problems and get diagnosed, then what the mental health system tends to do and say, well, this stuff that's bothering you, it's not what you think it is. Actually, it's a sign of your illness. But then people end up with kind of a spoiled identity, a sense of being occupied by illness. If they really adopt this way of looking at themselves, now they see their experiences involving things like chemical imbalances, misfiring synapses, or just generally mental health symptoms of a brain disease. What normalization does is it helps people come back to seeing their basic problem as being the same as everybody else's. Just variations, though possibly extreme variations, on the troublesome thoughts, feelings, impulses, worries, and imaginings that we all have, and something that they can learn to manage. That brings me to one possibly controversial area within CBT for psychosis and normalizing, which is whether or when it might be okay to think of psychotic experiences as being part of an illness. Um, you know, what's common for people initially when they first have psychotic experiences is they interpret those experiences to be some kind of impending catastrophe. And that really increases negative arousal, etc. And the mental health system tends to come in and say, oh, no, it's not what you thought it is. It's just mental illness. But the problem is that interpretation can also be very scary and can also play a part in that cycle that we talked about where the person's interpretation increases their arousal, their fear, and then causing increased symptoms and then more fear, etc. So there's really two approaches to this issue that are practiced by different CBT therapists. One is to talk about people's difficulties as being possibly related to an illness, but framing it as a manageable stress-related illness and trying to normalize it that way. So that usually involves emphasizing that there's lots of things a person can do in response to a stress-related illness. So it's trying to help them that way, not feel helpless in the face of it. But a second way is to talk about psychosis just as a possibly an understandable if problematic reaction to events. And I personally prefer doing that way because if we haven't done any medical tests that establish that the person has a specific illness, then really the person's experience might be more a reaction to trauma and life difficulties. And framing it that way, framing it as a reaction to life events, creates more of a sense that, well, maybe it's a reaction that the person can learn to change. While framing it as an illness carries the risk of convincing people that they're passive victims of an active illness, as Rufus May put it. Of course, you might wonder, since a lot of the conventional approaches to psychosis involve really emphasize trying to get people to have insight into their illness, right? Then if we avoid even talking about illness, isn't there a problem with us possibly being seen as colluding with someone who's in denial, assisting them, for example, and asserting that there's nothing wrong with them when really there is? And that's one reason why CBT therapists say it's important to normalize but not minimize. CBT involves working to understand exactly what's causing problems in the person's life as best we can determine, and then helping figure out together how to reduce those problems. So this process of collaborating and creating a detailed understanding of that is what's called developing a formulation, which I'm going to be covering in another module. The key fact to recognize is that problems don't have to be an illness or to be categorically different than other human problems in order to be really severe sometimes. And that what's really important is just that we help people and face the problems they actually have clearly. And that doesn't require framing the problems as an illness. Another reason to be careful to not be seen as minimizing people's problems is that if you do so, the person might see you as lacking empathy for the situation. So you want to really notice the way their problems have tipped, remember tipping points, into being as extreme as they are, while still being on a continuum with the normal. And as in the way it's fairly normal to be worried that people laughing as they come into a room might be laughing about me. But if I become too sure this is happening, I might accuse the other people of laughing at me, and then I'll start being seen as paranoid, and my relationships might really start to deteriorate. So I think it's important to notice that if you tell me that my accusing people of laughing at me is a symptom of my mental illness, I might just feel really stuck or overly reliant just on taking pills to control the problem. And then if they don't work, I feel super stuck. But if you help me discover that I may have just gotten too carried away with the normal worrying about who might be laughing at me, then I might get hopeful that I could learn to worry a bit less. And I could also learn to be more circumspect about when I make accusations, even when I do have worries. So now you have more ideas about how to do normalizing. Um, so I want to give you a chance to watch an example of normalizing in action. So there's a link below to a video that features Doug Turkington, a leading CBT therapist, researcher, and author. And what Doug will be doing is demonstrating normalizing while working with an individual who's role playing a person diagnosed with schizophrenia. So what I want you to do is watch the video and then notice both what you think you did that seemed to you to be really effective, and also try to notice anything you think that might not have been so good or that might lead to more problems later. And then share some of your observations in the comment area or questions or whatever. I really look forward to hearing you there.